Hello, all you world changers out there. This is Coach Jeremy here for a little podcast about one of what I think is the most broad form of, well, actually, two sections, two theorists in the helping relations section, which is still the heavy hitter in this NCE exam, and of course in the CPCE and many others as well. And that's CBT and REBT. I always like to talk about them together, back to back, because there's a lot of similarities, but there's also some very obvious differences that you're going to need to know on to be successful on this exam. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Starting with CBT. And first of all, when it comes to CBT, one of the things I always mention to the students that I work with is, why is anyone in therapy to begin with? Because of how they're thinking. So how do we got to work on what they're thinking? So I always tell people on an exam, if you get a question and you have absolutely no idea what the answer is, you can't even roll out any of them, but CBT is an option, it's not a bad option to go with. Unless, of course, the person might be, if they're mentally ill, then that may be a little bit different because now we're dealing with cognitive recognition and that might be off kilt. But again, CBT, why are we in therapy to begin with? Because of how we're thinking, which is negative. Obviously, we're not going to bring in happy stories to the counseling session. So, what do we do with CBT? It's about that stinking thinking, identifying those negative thoughts and replacing them with more constructive thoughts. So, what are those negative thoughts, you might ask? Well, polarized thinking. A student who gets an A minus on an exam but feels like a failure because they are used to getting A plus grades only. That's an example. They have the mentality, if I'm not successful at everything I do, I'm a complete failure. Polarized thinking, that is. Also, mental filtering. The negative mental filtering is an example. An employee receives a good performance review but focuses on one negative comment that their manager made about them. Disqualifying the positive. Student could get a good grade but overlooks it and tries to explain their good grade as simply luck or a fluke instead of acknowledging their hard work. It's when we overgeneralization. Student receives a bad grade on one exam based on that they think they are stupid and a failure and believes that all future exams will get bad grades as well. Jumping to conclusions such as mind reading. A friend you are spending time with seems distracted or uninterested, so you jump to the conclusion that you're the problem. Another example, fortune telling. You have a date, but you predict the date will go bad. You make the assumptions about the date before it has occurred. It's almost like declaring yourself a failure before you even get started. Catastrophizing. Magnification. Person's lunch date is running late and assumes the worst. The worries escalate quickly and thoughts become exaggerated. Minimization. An athlete wins an award but does not acknowledge their accomplishment. They minimize the importance of the award. Then there's personalization. You attend a party, but all your friends are busy engaging with other people. You feel like they do not have any interest in being your friend and engaging in conversation with you. This makes you think you don't belong or are unfairly excluded. And of course, blaming. Placing blame for relationship issues on your partner instead of sharing the responsibility for actions taken by both partners. You assume the victim mentality and think everything they do is to hurt you. Again, those were cognitive distortion examples. CBT, though, keep that in mind. The leading proponent of cognitive and behavioral counseling, we have a whole army of people. Joseph Wolpe, Meckenbaum, Beck, Bandura, Ellis. Remember that name, Albert Ellis. We're going to come back to him later. And keep in mind, people always ask, do I have to match the theorists to the theories? Well, you could look at it that way, but as I mentioned, in CBT, there's a whole army of them. Now, again, thoughts, emotions, behavior, CBT. What we think affects how we act and feel. What we feel affects what we think and do, and what we do affects how we think and feel. So again, techniques may include all the following: operating classical conditioning, social modeling, problem solving, direct training, reinforcement, decision making. The goal of counseling in this approach is to identify antecedents of behavior and the nature of reinforcements maintaining that behavior. Counselor helps to create learning conditions and may engage in direct intervention. Again, CBT. And I always, like I said before, and I told you, remember a certain name. And if you remember that name, it was Albert Ellis, because he, if you recall, was in that whole army of people, but now he jumps over to REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy, negative thinking, or irrational thinking, if you will, negative self-talk. Now, again, I mentioned that it's similar, but there's a few very distinct differences that separate this from CBT that you need to know so you don't get stumped on the exam. First of all, the term crooked thinking or crooked thinking, that's what they call. So again, if you see that term, it's not CBT, it's REBT, crooked thinking. It also follows a technique called the ABCDE approach. And I like to think of this technique kind of like, you know how in life there's when a domino effect happens where I just had this happen and this happens and this happens and everything kind of piles up. Well, this is basically in a domino where an external event, action or activity, followed by the belief that you form from that, self-verbalization, the consequences for the effect, and then you dispute that irrational belief, which is causing the effect behavior, and that effect is changing your self-verbalization. So in other words, I mentioned this domino effect, but on this domino effect, you have to then eventually flip that domino and push it in a different direction. So again, this is similar. And of course, the coulda, shoulda, wouldas, those negative self-talk, negative ways of thinking. So again, keep that in mind. Masturbations, that is the negative way of thinking. Shoulda, coulda, woulda. That talk, negative talk. So again, similar, but Albert Ellis is REBT. So again, when you hear that name, your first thought should be REBT. And when that term crooked thinking and the ABCDE approach, those are the two things that should basically set off bells and whistles for REBT. So keep that in mind. Again, I always like to talk about these two, CBT and REBT, together because they have a similarity, but they have some distinct differences. So I figured that we need to kind of discuss them and dissect them with each other, next to each other, so we know what is what. Because on the exam, it's going to be one or the other. So again, that is Albert Ellis and REBT and CBT with a whole full army of people. So a little bit of a podcast today for CBT and REBT. Again, this information comes from that of Hellwig. So good luck on your exam. Happy studying, and of course, reach out for any information regarding this domain or any others. Have a good rest of your night. Signing off, Coach Jeremy.